Right. This book is a bit of a lightning rod for a lot of folks. But is it just more culture war ammo? Does it miss the point of what's happening in the social justice reckoning in our culture? Or is it actually a really important and thoughtful corrective and analysis? Well, I have some thoughts. Let's take a look. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, so Cynical Theories here by Helen, Pluckrose, and James Lindsay. I'm going to comment on the main idea, and then as usual, the research, the readability, and the reasonableness, at least as I see it. So this book is pretty popular, at least in certain circles right now. And the main idea, approach of the authors is, well, it's a couple things. It's part historical survey of academic culture and work for the past 5-ish decades, since the 60s, 70s. So it's part of an historical survey about what exactly took place that out of which this postmodern justice activist kind of scholarship emerged. Like, how did historically that happen? But it's also more even than that. It's an intellectual, philosophical analysis of the thought and literature and work that's come out of that cultural movement. So it traces the emergence of activist scholarship out of the 60s, and it traces it in 3 main phases, at least as they kind of structure it. 60s era, then the 80s, 90s era, and then the most recent one, the 2010s. And it also traces subtopics within this kind of broad activist scholarship lens. So there's a chapter on post-colonial theory, there's a chapter on queer theory, there's a chapter on critical race theory, disability studies, so on and so forth. So they trace these specific permutations of the movement, and it's kind of a lot. So I'm trying to boil this down to one main idea, but also importantly, they pose that there are 2 main principles of postmodern academic thought, and then 4 kind of themes, and they trace these 2 principles and these 4 themes through each of the subtopics that they investigate. Whew, so that's a lot. Historical survey, intellectual philosophical analysis, themes and principles. It's a lot boiled down into this book. And I want to comment on whether or not they are successful at kind of doing what they're trying to do. And then in that note, the research is important to talk about. The research here is really excellent, I thought. They are very careful in their use and documentation of sources, and particularly as this is an analysis of, but basically it's like a literature review. Each chapter is kind of a literature review of each of these major topics. Each chapter draws on primary texts within each field. And the sources I think are well used. They're fairly represented. I feel like one of the things that I kept thinking is that this is kind of like a giant steelman argument, honestly. As someone who's read a decent amount of these different critical theories, not claiming to be an expert, but I have read some of it, and I feel like they fairly represent it. They do primary quotations, they do block quotes to really make sure you get the context of what people are saying, and it's all carefully articulated and carefully noted, so you can chase it down on your own if you want. I thought it was very excellent research. In terms of readability, there are 2 things about this book that exist at the same time. It's very clear. It's like very clearly written. It's not unnecessarily complicated, in my view. But it's also very dense. So it's clear and dense at the same time. And part of that's because they cover so much ground in relatively few page count. I mean, they touch lots of topics in these different chapters, and the whole book's about 270 pages. So they move through a lot of territory, and they comment on lots of scholars. And so therefore, in order to contain it, it's pretty dense. And so I found myself, I worked through this one a bit slower than I do most books of this type, just because of the density of it, and I was trying to really internalize the stuff that they were saying. But thankfully, they write in a very clear manner, unlike actually a lot of the scholars they comment on, which can be just completely opaque and difficult to parse out. Their writing style is not that, thankfully. So it's a little bit of a, it is readable, but it's also dense at the same time, if that makes sense. Readable in its prose, in its style, but also dense in the amount of material that it covers. But I will say one more thing on the readability. The principles, the 2 principles and the 4 themes are a very helpful handle throughout the entire book. So they keep circling back to that. They establish it in the beginning and they keep circling back to here's where these principles show back up in this area of scholarship. Here's how you can see these themes working out in this scholarship. And man, that goes a long way towards really helping as a structure, organizational structure of the book. That goes a long way towards helping the reader grasp the entirety of the argument. So, so overall, very good, with that caveat about it being a pretty dense read. And then finally, the reasonableness of this. Man, there's a lot that one could say about this book because they cover so much material. I'm going to try to keep my comments short on this. But I think about the reasonableness kind of in three subcategories of the historical analysis, the philosophical analysis or intellectual analysis, and then also the solutions they propose. So I want to comment on each of those three things. I think the strongest is the philosophical analysis. I mean, that's basically a home run, honestly. I mean, this book, just in terms of presenting summaries of so much different scholarship and then pointing out potential problems with it or contradictions or difficulties in the epistemologies, that stuff is it's just a gold mine for that. I loved all of that material. It's extremely helpful. Even I think for someone who hasn't read material in these areas of work, academic work, I think they do an admirable job at presenting it and analyzing it, and yes, critiquing it. But the philosophical intellectual analysis is I think it's just outstanding. It's one of the strongest things that I appreciated about it. The historical analysis is also, I think, pretty good, but it's just they spend less time on it. And so there are times when it feels a little bit like a gloss. Like they pose these interesting ideas about this is probably saying things like this is probably why this area of scholarship emerged at this time because of these cultural events. And it's really intriguing and kind of compelling. I think some of it probably makes sense, but they just don't dig into it as deeply, maybe partly because of the scope of the book. They just had to limit the scope of it somewhere. So know that they comment on history and they pose ideas about why these things might have occurred when they did, but it's a little less rigorous than the philosophical intellectual material. Still intriguing, but maybe a little bit less careful or less rigorous. And then finally, the solutions they pose. Now, most of the book is not devoted, most of the book for sure is devoted to the intellectual analysis, which is why that's the strongest component, I think. Really, the solutions are kind of limited to the last chapter, and their solution is essentially a kind of a defense of classical liberalism and empiricism and science and objective reasoning that's decoupled from group identity as a way of mediating truth, and especially decoupled from language and discourses, kind of the Derrida, Foucault biopower ideas. It's like they're trying to reassert or redefend classical liberalism in the face of those ideas. So that's basically their solution, is to say, let's get back to defending classical liberalism and empirical reasoning and kind of decouple from so much of this identitarian kind of approach towards reason and truth. That's basically their defense. And it's one that I largely agree with, to be honest, but I felt that their solution was, maybe it's just by virtue of page count, maybe it's by virtue of so much of the weight of the book is in these other areas. I felt it was less compelling, less robust, less rigorous. And so just know that going into it. It's more an analysis of the state of culture and academics than it is a rousing solution. And there's one piece, I just want to say one piece that I think is missing. And I think it is... There's something about, and this gets into metaphysical territory, which is what they're not trying to do this, and I get that, but there's something about the loss of a transcendent reference point in terms of our metaphysics that I do think has serious implications for the turn into applied postmodernism, and they don't discuss it. They kind of leave metaphysics off the table, probably by design. I know at least James Lindsay is a very outspoken atheist and doesn't get into metaphysics, and some of that's probably intentional. But I couldn't help but put this book down and feel like that was a missing piece, which is why I really appreciate philosophers like Charles Taylor and Remy Brogg, who people I've talked about on this channel a lot, who talk about the transcendent referent point and the loss of that, the eclipse of that as we moved into modernity, which set the ground for the postmodern turn, which they cover really well. So there's a missing piece in there that I think is an interesting conversation partner for the solutions they want to propose. But that all being said, man, this is an excellent book. It's an excellent analysis. It's an excellent survey of scholarship and critique. And I would really recommend it for those who are bewildered by the postmodern, applied postmodern landscape that we're living in. So I hope that you found this helpful. And if you read books like Cynical Theories or found other ones helpful, let me know. Put them in the comments below. Maybe I'll be able to take a look at them. But thanks for watching.